Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest Year-Ender podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome two of our star contributors. In Washington, we have Annelle Sheline, a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And on this side of the pond, Tarek Megerisi, a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you both.
Thanks so much, Bill. Great to be here.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure as always.
Well, I'm going to open with you, Annelle. Your pick of the top Middle East story of 2025. My goodness, we've got a lot to choose from. None of it very happy, I'm afraid. Is it the Gaza war? Is it the brief war with Iran? Is it the civil war in Sudan? The Israeli attack on Qatar? That's just to mention a few. So, Annelle, your pick for the top story in the Middle East in 2025.
Yes, I mean, everything you mentioned is important. I thought that really the top story, at least that got the most media attention, would be the so-called 12-day war initiated by Israel against Iran. And, part of the reason I think this qualifies as the top story is the ongoing repercussions. We know that Netanyahu is going to be back in Washington on January 29th and is going to push for U.S. involvement in another attack on Iran. The Israelis are claiming they're concerned about Iran's ballistic missile program, which Israel damaged earlier this year. They're continuing to express concerns about Iran's nuclear program, again, ignoring the fact that Israel itself is the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East, but they refuse to countenance the possibility that Iran might push for nuclear weapons, which in the aftermath of Israel's unprovoked attack on Iran, it would be quite rational for Iran to move forward with trying to establish nuclear deterrence and to be prepared to defend itself. But, I think another reason this was such an important story is the fact that Israel successfully got the United States to join the war on Iran by also launching attacks that fortunately ended that round of aggression. And we do know that Trump insisted that Israel not continue the war after those significant U.S. strikes on several Iranian nuclear sites. However, it does reiterate the extent to which U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East under Trump, under Biden, under a long succession of previous American presidents is dictated by Israeli preferences about the region, in particular now in the past year and in recent history, this aggressive posture towards Iran. So for all those reasons, I selected that story as the most significant news story and events of this year.
Yeah, that's a really interesting pick. And as you say, the implications roll on much further than the 12-day war. Of course, Trump claiming that another war that he concluded another on his march towards a Nobel Peace Prize. But do you think, Annelle, that given the weight of opprobrium that he's facing, certainly within the MAGA movement, that Netanyahu will be able to sway him for another attack?
That's a great question, Bill. And I think that is another huge story of this year is not only the mobilization against continued U.S. military operations against Iran, but also just the growing recognition of the incompatibility between a so-called America First foreign policy and a foreign policy dictated by Israeli preferences. And as you've said, this is splintering his coalition. His popularity has tanked for many reasons, but not least because he pledged to come in with no new wars, no more stupid wars, and yet we had the United States involved on Israel's behest, fighting this war against Iran. And just to remind people that there were ongoing negotiations at the time that Israel attacked Iran. And part of the reason for that had to do with the fact that Trump had claimed that he was going to come in and get a better nuclear deal. And then, unfortunately, the Trump administration adopted the Israeli talking point that Iran should not be permitted to enrich uranium at all, which it is legally permitted to do under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which it is a signatory. And yet, the Israelis and then the Trump administration said that was not going to be permitted, even though Iran had already said that was a red line. And so when the Trump administration adopted that position, that foreseeably deadlocked negotiations. Trump got frustrated and then seemingly greenlit an Israeli attack, even though there were these ongoing negotiations. So not only does that have implications for whether Iran would have any reason to engage in future negotiations? But then we saw the Israelis do this again with their attack on Qatar, which is another huge story in terms of the implications for how the GCC countries and other U.S. security partners view the value of the U.S. security guarantee, because Israel attacked a major non-NATO ally in Qatar on September 9th. So the Israelis are unfortunately doing everything they can to undermine peaceful negotiations and instead to adopt a purely kinetic and bellicose approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, okay. Let's move to you, Tarek, and your pick for the top Middle East story of 2025.
Yeah, it seems weird to frame it as kind of top or in that way, but I mean, I think in many ways we just have to call 2025 once again a year of genocide. In the sense that every other story that you mentioned, and some of the other big ones that you didn't, like the kind of birth of a new nation in Syria, have all been defined, shaped, corroded by, these two ongoing genocides. One is the wiping off of Gaza, the ancient city of Gaza and its people off the map, and then the other one is the extermination of many different tribes and peoples in Sudan by the Arab supremacist rapid support forces. And I think, as you continue to kind of even look at how stories develop, you can see the ongoing echoes of this. Look at how the Israelis lashed out at Iran, at Qatar, at Syria over the course of the year, how this evolved from one conflict or one attack in Gaza into an attempt to reshape the region, or in terms of how the region manages itself. Even today's top story is about the Egyptian gas deal with the Israelis, which the Israeli parliament just ratified. And so you see how the domino effect from this initial act of genocide is even, impacting Egypt's economy, let alone the shipping lanes of the Red Sea, the development of other nations. And yeah, perhaps something we can go into later, which is this kind of brave new order for the Middle East.
Yeah, a brave new order, and you're right to mention Syria. Uh, just on Syria, Tarek, your thoughts about how al-Shara is proceeding and whether Syria is going to move into a better place, or is it going to be returning to the kind of formidable and harsh dictatorship that it experienced for so many decades?
I mean, al-Shara is proceeding cautiously, which I suppose is something positive. Because if you look back to at least my formative experience, which is the Arab Spring, everybody jumped into that with full enthusiasm and perhaps not enough caution and thoughtfulness. And so that caution is a good sign. But it's one man trying to fight the world right now, it looks like. So there's the management of relations with the likes of Turkey, Saudi, the Gulf states, the United States of America, and the Israelis. There is, of course, the continued aggression by the Israelis, the attempts to foment civil war and civil strife between different ethnic groups, the capturing of key water sources and resources, which has not been commented upon enough, I think, considering how much the droughts and its impact on agriculture, started the ball rolling in Syria back in 2011. So it's uncertain how the chips will fall. Everything is still up in the air right now, but I think that there are positive signs along with the usual caution. But right now, Syria is just one ship in a very, very big storm. So it's almost impossible to predict.
Yeah. And now, before I ask you about your thoughts on the Middle East story of 2025 that the big news organizations missed, I just want to get your comment on Syria and your thoughts on how that is proceeding. And it's just about a year, isn't it, since al-Sharaa raced into Damascus and ran al-Assad regime out of the country.
Yes, I think the piece of that I've been especially struck by is, on the one hand, I absolutely welcome the decision by the Trump administration to lift the sanctions. It's absolutely appropriate given that those sanctions were leveled on the Bashar al-Assad regime, which is obviously no longer in power. But at the same time, the swiftness with which the US government has expunged the record of someone that had such a significant bounty for terrorist activity on his head, I think just reiterates some of the fundamental dishonesty of the war on terror, of the sort of portrayal of these individuals as the worst of the worst, and these are terrorists and they're irrational and we can't engage with them or negotiate with them. And yet suddenly we're willing to recognize al-Sharaa as and he is. I mean, I'm not questioning that he shouldn't be the leader of Syria, at least especially in this transitional moment. I mean, the hope would be that perhaps the Syrian people would be permitted to elect their own representatives in the hopefully near or medium term. But again, just that the swiftness with which that characterization of him as a terrorist has been forgotten and wiped away. Again, I think just we should all keep in mind that fact when the Trump administration is then trying to portray, or any future US administration is trying to portray someone else as a terrorist, whether it's Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela or anyone else that they're trying to target with violence and trying to justify that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Annelle. The way Trump embraced so quickly a man who not that long ago had a bounty on his head. I think the figure was $10 million that was placed on him by the administration, the U.S. government. And it reflects the shallowness of the war on terror labeling and the ease with which it's used by Washington to justify military action, be it in the Middle East or, well, over many decades, or as you say, in Venezuela now. But let me ask you, what, in your opinion, is the Middle East story that big Western news organizations missed in 2025?
Well, I very much appreciate Tarek's point about this continuing to be a year of genocide. And, for me, I think a huge story that was overlooked this year was the horrors underway in Sudan that I think could, given that the official designation of genocide was applied to the Darfur genocide in the early 2000s, we have many of those same dynamics and actors, unfortunately, at it again in Sudan. The Janjaweed militia are now essentially, this is what makes up the rapid support forces that are pushing against the Sudanese armed forces, both of which have foreign backing, the UAE backing the RSF, Saudi Arabia and others backing these sort of so-called official Sudanese armed forces. So it is, that story is my understanding is this is the most significant humanitarian and displacement crisis that the world has ever witnessed. And yet, as Tarek pointed out, it is really not getting anywhere near the level of either news coverage or the sort of response in terms of trying to fund humanitarian assistance to help these people. That 12 million people have fled their homes. We've seen horrific violence carried out by all sides, but in particular the RSF. And again, it's simply not getting the level of attention or support that it requires. I think another big overlooked story is the willingness of the news media to stick to this fiction of a ceasefire, that, the media continues to portray what was agreed to on October 10th in Gaza as a ceasefire, when you have Israel engaging in daily violations, daily airstrikes, continuing to provide a tiny fraction of the agreed upon aid, still blocking tents and any sort of winterization material to prevent babies in Gaza from literally freezing to death, in addition to not having medicine, not having food. So that I think is really shocking. And I think part of why you've had a willingness to play along with that narrative of a ceasefire has to do with the successful censorship. We've seen efforts by a coalition of billionaires, including Larry Ellison, but also backed by the UAE and other actors, to purchase TikTok, knowing that many American young people and other young people around the world are getting much of their news from TikTok, refusing to believe the Hasbara or Israeli propaganda, and turning against Israel. And as we already mentioned, this has big political implications for Trump and the Republican Party, and questioning the future of this unconditional massive amount of U.S. security assistance that Israel gets every year. And not to mention the fact that Israel has intentionally targeted with murder hundreds of journalists inside Gaza, such that we're not getting as much news coverage out of Gaza anymore, because, again, the infrastructure is destroyed. It's difficult to get information out, and the journalists have been killed. If I can, Bill, add just one more, it would be the increasing price of dissidence or advocacy on behalf of Palestine. Under Biden, we know that already they used this canard of anti-Semitism to target individuals who engaged in advocacy on behalf of Palestinian self-determination and human rights. But under Trump, that price went way up in terms of people losing their freedom. There were obviously the high-profile campus protesters, people like Mahmoud Khalil, who has thankfully now been released. But there are others, people that haven't gotten nearly as much attention, like Leka Cordia, who remains imprisoned in Texas. Other people who've been imprisoned who weren't campus, they weren't students, but they engaged in some sort of online advocacy for Palestine. People like Yaqub Vihandre or Vijandre, is who I'm thinking of, but many others remain in detention.
Yeah, indeed. Here in the United Kingdom, there are people on hunger strike in prison.
Right, who are close to death.
Well, indeed, it's a very dangerous situation for some of these people, and that's not getting very much coverage at all here. And of course, these are people who are with Palestine Action. They've been declared a supporter of terrorism. Hundreds more have been charged under terror legislation for peacefully protesting. Those arrests. So that's, again, I take your point about there has been a real repression of fair comment by the various governments here in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. But Tarek, let me ask you now your thoughts on the Middle East story that the big news organizations have missed.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll just end up building on what Annelle so expertly spoke about. And kind of in this year of big sexy headlines, I can kind of understand why the deeper story isn't really picked up upon. But I do want to comment more on this idea of kind of the death of the order that we know and the new order that's coming in its place. And I think that this spreads broader than the Middle East. Just as Annelle and you were just talking about in terms of the Gaza associated story. You've got the hunger strikers in the UK. Yes, you've got those who are arrested in the US. You also have UN officials, ICC prosecutors, ICC judges who are now on sanctions lists and for all intents and purposes, are basically frozen economic entities, which shows you that we all kind of pay a price for this, because the international structures that we know, that we rely upon, that kind of shape the world that we know, are now crumbling under the pressure of forcing this ongoing extermination. And the two genocides are inextricably linked to each other. They're almost two sides of the same coin. And if you kind of take a step back, you can see that in the projects where aggressive actors, or those who see themselves as new hegemons, be it the Israelis or the Emiratis or others, are operating, it's almost like we're moving away from an old model for the Middle East, which is one of strong centralized nation states under autocrats of some kind, and moving towards, I think, what can best be described as almost a sea of chaos, with kind of pockets of stability under the control of some warlord or some dictator or some authoritarian, and these bigger powers believing that they are able to influence or to shape or to basically order around these petty warlords in order to protect key assets or to encourage, certain activities. And we see this in Yemen on both sides. The new the STC forces now controlling all of South Yemen, and looking to break away once again. You've got the Iranian-backed Houthis in the north. Even if you go to Libya, you see the kind of role of Khalifa Haftar, who is technically a non-state actor, but on behalf of his international patrons, he's gun running to the Sudanese. He's smuggling fuel to help the Russians escape sanctions. He's smuggling people. He's smuggling drugs. And this is the region that we're moving towards. This is the model that the Israelis and others are trying to impart upon Syria, by sponsoring various ethnic groups and trying to carve out parts of the country. This is something that you know those who have been suffering from conflict for a longer time, like Iraq, are starting to endure and starting to see. So this new regional order and the implications of it is the kind of overlooked story, and the thing that we should all be examining more, is this is the reality we are going to have to live with for the next generation.
Yeah, that's you've touched on a really, really important point. Can I just throw in my thought about the big news story that's been missed? And I think that's the United Arab Emirates. So you've touched on the Emiratis. They're involved very much backing the RSF in Sudan, as you say, backing Khalifa Haftar. If you look at what they have achieved in 2025 by both soft power and hard power, they are becoming a regional hegemon. And I think that this is a story that has been largely ignored by the big news organizations. So what do you think? What do you think, Annelle?
Absolutely. And that maybe takes us into the next point about things to watch moving forward, because I definitely think, as Tarek mentioned, the fact that the Southern Transitional Council now controls essentially all of the former South Yemen, and they are heavily backed by the UAE, and the other ways in which the UAE has been asserting itself. I do think it is interesting because the UAE for such a long time was very careful about image management, and the fact that we have seen fairly significant news coverage of, in particular, I would say, their backing of the RSF and the atrocities they're committing. It seems like the mask is slipping a bit, and I wonder if that reflects the scale of what they've been involved with, and it's just difficult to continue to maintain their the very positive image that they had cultivated, or if they just don't really care anymore and they feel that they no longer have to be quite so cautious about managing their sort of perception in the U.S. or abroad. But as far as thinking about trends to pay attention to and for the next year,
Sorry, now let me just stop you there because I want to get back to Tarek before we get to trends for next year.
oh,
Uh,
sorry.
yeah, no, that's all right. Tarek, your thoughts on the UAE and Mohammed bin Zayed and what he's accomplished in 2025?
Yeah, I'm not sure accomplished is the right word. But he's the vision of that the Emiratis have is certainly going on leaps and bounds. And I think, as Annelle was kind of hinting at, there comes a point where you have to go all in. So, they've been very good at kind of quietly supporting the change that they would like to see in the world. In the Libyan war, by backing Haftar and growing those forces from 2014 onwards, nobody really uttered the words of the UAE despite their prominent role. It got a bit bigger in 2019, 2020. In Yemen, of course, they became a lot more apparent. And now in Sudan, I think that, yeah, the mask is kind of fallen off. And I think that, as you guys pointed out, it's partially a fact that I don't think that they care so much anymore. They feel like the United States is easier to manage in this age of Trump and in this age of kind of naked lust for power and admiration of power and the subjugation of the kind of moral standards and concepts that we used to hold on to, even if we held on to them fallaciously just for the sake of having them. That deference is completely gone, which I think helps the Emirati position. And if you'll remember, the last time the Emiratis really stuck their heads out, which was with the Libyan civil war, was during the last Trump administration. So yes, I mean, even if we leave the boundaries of MENA slightly and we look to Somalia, to Ethiopia, you can see that the Emiratis are exponentially growing in their adventurism. And what I've always said is that Abu Dhabi is big on vision, but very short on implementation. And so I don't know if it's the plan or if it's the unfortunate side effect, but all they seem to be doing is sowing chaos. And like I said before, trying to preserve islands and corridors of stability that they believe they can control amidst that kind of broader sea of chaos. But philosophically speaking, I think that's a fool's errand, but I'm sure we'll be speaking about that for years to come.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and my guests, the European Council on Foreign Relations, Tarek Megerisi, and Annelle Sheline from the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to receive our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. It may turn out to be some gloomy predictions then from you two in 2026, but Annelle, what should we be looking out for in the Middle East in this coming year?
Yeah, I think that in particular, as Tarek was mentioning, pay attention to what the UAE is up to. In particular, I know I will be watching events in Yemen. I anticipate that we will continue to see more news out of Yemen, which on the one hand, the conflict in Yemen had been fairly stalemated insofar as, well, sort of internal Yemeni dynamics, we hadn't seen large shifts. Obviously, we had seen both under Biden and under Trump, the U.S. engaging in significant airstrikes on Yemen in retaliation for the Houthi efforts to blockade the Red Sea and specifically to blockade the Israeli port of Eilat in response to the Israel's genocide in Gaza. But then just recently, as Tarek mentioned, seeing the STC consolidate control, and the question now will be whether Saudi Arabia will respond, because the Saudis had backed sort of different factions in this constellation of power on the Presidential Leadership Council, and this consolidation of control by the STC is a major slap in the face for Saudi Arabia, which has traditionally seen itself as, if not responsible for Yemen, sort of seeing Yemen as its own backyard. And so seeing the UAE expand its influence, and as you mentioned, sort of the UAE looking to establish control over this important geographic position on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the sort of area around Socotra. I expect that we will see more out of Yemen. I think another important thing to keep in mind is whether or not the United States is going to take over Israel's occupation in Gaza, or if, which is sort of what the 20-point plan seemed to be doing. Obviously, the initial plan was to have other countries involved in the International Stabilization Force, but at this point, we haven't seen any countries stepping up, largely because Israel continues to engage in airstrikes and has in no way held to the terms of the ceasefire. And so, understandably, other countries are not eager to send service members into a situation like that. And so it's an open question of whether the U.S. will take over responsibility for the occupation, or if Trump will allow Israel to continue to conduct military operations, consolidate control on the eastern side of the so-called Yellow Line, which accounts for more than 50% of the territory of Gaza. I fear, I mean, neither outcome is good. I fear that it looks like the Israelis are looking to consolidate that control. On the other hand, if the U.S. were to take over the occupation, that would certainly not be good either, and could certainly lead, in the event that U.S. service members or contractors were killed or injured in a violent attack, that then the U.S. could double down and send more significant military presence and sort of further entrench the U.S. occupation in Palestine, which is certainly not an outcome that I would wish to see. But again, on the other hand, Israel has demonstrated their complete disregard for Palestinian life, or really the lives of Arabs across the region, Arabs or Iranians or anyone else. So I would pay particular attention to those two areas, as well as to ongoing repression. And one resource I would point people to is there's an organization called Defending Rights and Dissent, which you can sign up for. They have a Gaza First Amendment alert, and they pay very close attention to the ways that the U.S. administration is targeting people for advocacy on behalf of Palestine.
Okay, defending rights and dissent. So people want to find out and get the goods on that particular side of the story. That's a good source, as Annelle mentioned. Tarek, I'm thinking about Libya, your country. I'm thinking about Sudan, Yemen. We've covered. I'm probably right to think that you'll agree with Annelle's take on Yemen. But what about you? What should we be looking for in 2026 in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'm just gonna borrow from the excellent contours that Annelle already kind of shaped out. I think if we look forward, if I said that 2025 was defined by a beating heart of genocide, 2026 will be defined by the friction between the middle powers who are climbing out of the parapet over 2025 in such a disgusting way. I mean, as Annelle pointed out, you're seeing this friction heat up between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Saudi is the traditional hegemon, at least for the modern and the postmodern era of the Middle East. Its backyard in Yemen, or at least as it perceives it, is now going to have a secessionist movement. They are trying to pressure the United States in Sudan to not toe the Emirati line. The Saudis have even quietly returned to the Libya file. I think again on this idea of countering the UAE. So the split between MBS and MBZ, it's not just kind of fracturing out through the broader region, it's also fracturing through the GCC. So keep an eye on Kuwait and Qatar and the ramifications of it there. Of course, we've talked a lot about the Israelis and how Netanyahu is going to keep doubling down on spreading as much fire as he can to distract from the fires that he's already started. And as Annelle pointed out a lot earlier on, this idea of a return to war with Iran and what the ramifications of that could be. And then you have the kind of either the weakened powers like Iran, which nevertheless still have some cards to play and are being forced to play them by the aggressiveness of others, or the opportunist, adventurous ones like Turkey, who are making a roaring trade off of drones in this day and age, and of showing themselves to be a reliable, predictable security partner in an era of chaos to the Americans and to others. But behind that thin veneer, they are one of the main exploitative actors in Libya. They are beginning to clash with the Emiratis in Sudan and elsewhere through Africa. So again, there are points of friction showing up there, and lastly, with the if I said that Saudi is the modern hegemon, then Egypt is the ancient hegemon, and everywhere it's being squeezed between a rock and a hard place. If you look north to Palestine, east to Libya, south to Sudan, and in many of those places, it's between a rock and a hard place because the hard place are the fracturing, destructive, destabilizing conflicts that it's neighboring. And the rock is the Emiratis, the rock that had propped up the Egyptian economy for so long. But what does the Egyptian elite do when they either have to turn to openly oppose Emirati foreign policy and thereby sacrifice their main credit line, given their extremely poorly performing and dysfunctional economy? Or do they just simply acquiesce to the chaos that's being sown on their borders? So all of these are big questions that need to be resolved. And as we all know, questions in our part of the world don't get resolved. They just continue to burn. And so these are the kind of stories that I'm looking out for in the year forward to see how these points of friction resolve or spark or otherwise impact one another.
Well, okay. I thank you both. There is some possibility of solace, and that the new year brings some hope for the people in the Middle East who have had too many decades of turmoil and chaos and terrible, ambitious dictators. I suppose I don't want to end on a negative note, so I will end by wishing you both the best in the holiday season and the best in 2026. And thanks again very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Bill. Yes, unfortunately, not a lot of reasons for optimism, but hope springs eternal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill, for all the invitations to join and to talk these issues out. Yeah, we'll keep building in the years to come. Thank you, and I'm sure we'll be here to discuss it as we move along.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having you both back on the podcast in 2026. Thanks again.
Thank you.
My guest today on our year-end review and look ahead to 2026 were the Quincy Institute's Annelle Sheline and Tarek Megerisi from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Want to support that independent voice? Head to the website arabdigest.org and look out for the offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening, and we wish you the best in the holiday season and the new year. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.